Hey Code Crew, last week we talked about what APIs were. If you missed that video, check it out right over there. This week, let's talk about what JSON is and why it's so important, especially for mobile app development. By the end of this video, you'll understand how to read the JSON as well as how to parse JSON in Swift. Okay, so what is JSON? JSON is a standard data format, and it's often used for the response data that you get back from an API. For example, if you wanted to pull some information from Facebook, you'd make a request to the Facebook API endpoint for that information, and then the API would return the information to you in the JSON data format. That's why it's really important to understand how to read the JSON data format and how to parse it, which is just the technical term for processing the JSON data into a usable format for your app. In this video, I'll break down the JSON formatting so that you can understand it, and then I'll take you through a practical example of parsing JSON in Swift. There are only 3 things you need to know in order to understand the JSON data format. The first thing is what a key value pair is. The value part of the pair is the actual data, and the key part is usually a piece of text that describes what the data represents. Together, the key and the value represents one piece of data. To group together relevant key value pairs, use a comma to separate each key value pair, and then put a pair of curly brackets around the entire group. When you organize a group of key value pairs together like this, it's called a JSON object. And furthermore, to create a list of JSON objects, use a comma to separate each JSON object, and then put a pair of square brackets around the entire list. When you organize a list of JSON objects together this way, it's called a JSON array. And basically, that's how data is organized in JSON format. Key value pairs, JSON objects, and JSON arrays. The only tricky part to keep in mind is that in a key value pair, the value isn't limited to being just a piece of text or just a number. The value part of a key value pair can also be a whole JSON object or a JSON array. In more complex JSON data files or data feeds, you'll see JSON data nested several hierarchies deep. Okay, now let's do a practical example of parsing JSON in Swift. But before we dive in, I just want to mention that support for this video comes from Atlantic.net, a hosting solution provider for healthcare HIPAA and PCI compliance. Whether you're starting fresh or need a new provider, Atlantic.net can help you succeed with fully audited solutions and 25 years of experience. Try Atlantic.net to develop, test, or launch your next project. These guys won't let you down. Right now, they're offering a free 1 gig virtual server with SSDs and block storage for free for a year, and free snapshots for 1 year too, plus $25 in free credits to use on any other services they offer. Ease of use is something that I like as it frees up my mind to focus on coding. I also like that they have round-the-clock phone support, so if I happen to get stuck, I can contact them easily. So visit atlantic.net/codewithchris and enter the code CHRIS to get your $25 free credit. Alright, now let's look at parsing JSON with Swift. So last week when we talked about APIs, I used this news API as a demo. So this time, with parsing JSON in Swift, we're going to use the same API, because when you make an API call to the news API, such as this one here, you get back a really nice JSON result. Now, before we dive into Xcode and take a look at how JSON is parsed in Swift, I first want to examine this JSON feed that the API returns, and I want to break down some of those things that I mentioned earlier on in this video, such as key value pairs, JSON objects, and JSON arrays. So if I collapse this feed, you can see that basically this is a JSON object. That's what this API call returns. And you know this because of these curly brackets containing a group of key value pairs. You can see here there are 3 key value pairs all separated by commas, exactly like how we described earlier. And each key value pair has a key, such as status, and the value, such as OK. Total results is a key. This number is a value. And remember when I said key value pairs, the value could also be another JSON object or a JSON array. It doesn't just have to be like a piece of text or a number. Well, this is a perfect example. Articles is a key, and the value is actually a JSON array. Take a look at this. There are square brackets here. And if you remember earlier on in this video, I said that to create a list of JSON objects, you surround it by square brackets like this, and then inside you have all of your JSON objects separated by commas. So let's expand this node and see what we get. So if I collapse these JSON objects just so we can have a good idea of what's in here, you can see that's exactly what it is. That's a JSON object surrounded by curly brackets and then a comma and then the second JSON object and so on and so forth. Now, if you examine actually the data inside these JSON objects, you'll see that all of them follow the same format, like they have the same collection of key value pairs. And that's because each of these JSON objects inside this articles key is an article. Check this out. You have author, you have title, you have description. All of these key value pairs make up the data for a single article. And the article's key, basically the value for that is a list of articles, right? It's a list of JSON objects which represent the articles. So this is very good information for us when we parse this JSON, because when you're parsing JSON, you want to think about what it actually is the information that you need to display in your app. So in this instance, if we were building a news app and we wanted to get a list of the articles to display, we would really be interested in extracting this information here in this array of JSON objects. So how does parsing JSON in Swift actually work? Well, there's something called the codable protocol, and it makes it very easy for us to parse this JSON out into usable instances of like a structure or a class that we create. And basically how it works is we map the JSON objects in this JSON feed to structures or classes that we create inside Swift. And for each of those classes, it's going to represent a different JSON object. So take this for instance, we have the overall JSON object representing the feed. So we're going to create a structure in our project to represent the news feed. And that structure is going to have the same properties mapping to these keys right here. And then inside here, we have these article JSON objects, right? So we're going to create an article structure inside our app to map to this data. So when we extract this JSON feed, we basically use the JSON decoder class, and it's going to try to basically create instances of the articles and instances of the news feed. That's basically how it works, but it's going to make a lot more sense when we jump into Xcode, and I'll show you exactly how easy it is, because explaining it like this is probably a little more abstract. So why don't we go ahead and jump into Xcode. So right here, I've got a brand new Xcode project. I don't have anything. Now let's start by creating those structures that we mentioned to represent the JSON objects in this feed. So here, this is kind of like the root JSON object, which represents the news feed. So I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to choose Swift file. I'm going to call this the news feed. And I'm going to declare a structure. I'm going to call it news feed. And it's going to conform to the codable protocol. And that's going to allow the JSON decoder to attempt to convert this JSON into an instance of this newsfeed structure. So I'm going to create the properties to map to these keys right here. Now, if there's a key value pair that you're not really interested in, you don't have to create a property mapping to it, but I'm going to just do it anyways. Now, when you're working, when you're mapping like this, and you know that the value for a certain key won't be nil, like it won't be empty, then I would suggest that you default it to some value like that. And the reason I say that is because, for example, this key right here, the value can be null. If that is the case, if it could be null, then you would want to create an optional instead, just so when you try to parse that out, you're not going to be trying to insert, if you default it to a value right here, then status can never be nil. And if status actually happened to be nil, when JSON decoder tries to turn that JSON into an instance of this, it's going to not really like that. And the way you can find out, depending on what API you're working on, is just check the documentation. So let's take a look at this endpoint here. Right, that's the endpoint. The rest are just parameters. So this is the everything endpoint. If you go to the documentation and you check out endpoints, let's check out the everything endpoint. You scroll down. Here's some reference about what sort of parameters you can supply into the API call. But if you take a look at the response, here's status, right? That's the key. And the value can be okay or error. So that's good. I know it's never going to be nil, right? So I can safely make this not an optional string. Same thing with total results. I don't think that this would be nil. It'd at least be 0, although it doesn't explicitly say that here. And as for the keys in the news article, unfortunately, it doesn't tell you if author can be nil or not, and title can be nil or not. Like, is there always going to be a title? I'm not sure based on this documentation. And we saw from this example out here that under source, ID can be null, right, or nil. But here it doesn't mention that it could be nil. So if I want to be extra safe and I want to prevent crashes during the JSON parsing, then I could just make everything an optional. But for the status, I'm not going to make it an optional because at least in the documentation it tells me that potential values is only okay or error. So that's a little tip for your JSON parsing. Okay, so let's go back to this. So we're building out our news feed structure. So I've got total results as well, and this is going to be an int. I'll just default it to 0. And then we've got articles. Now, articles is an array of JSON objects representing an article. However, I haven't created that structure to represent that JSON object yet. So I'm going to leave this as an error unfinished, and I'm going to jump to creating a structure to represent these JSON objects inside, which is essentially a single article. So let's go ahead and create a second structure, and then we'll come back to the newsfeed to finish it off. So I'm going to call this article, and this is going to be article, and remember it's still got to follow the Codeable protocol, and then we're going to map these properties to the keys here. Now I don't really care about the source, so I'm just going to omit that, but I do care about author, title, description, URL, URL to image, published at, content. All of these are strings. So and all of them, I'm not sure if they're going to be nil or not based on the documentation like we just checked. So all of these are going to be optional strings. And I have to make sure that the property names match the keys. They don't have to, but this is the easier way to do it by just making sure that they match. So JSON decoder is going to just do it automatically. It knows which key value pair maps to which property, and it's going to put the data in the right place. Otherwise, you're going to have to write a little bit of extra code to tell the JSON decoder what key value pairs match to what properties if the names don't match. Okay, so we've got content published at, URL to image, URL, description, title, and author, and I don't care about the source. So okay, so now we have an article structure that maps to this JSON object, right? So now I can go back and say that in the news feed that the articles key, right, is an array of our article structure, right? So it kind of maps there, and I'm gonna make this, like, I don't know if this can ever be nil or not, the value for articles. So to be safe, I'm just going to make it optional. Okay. All right, so that's basically it. So we've created structures to match and map to the JSON objects in the feed. Now all we have to do is write the iOS networking code to do the API call, get the response back, and then we're going to use JSON decoder to parse that JSON data into instances of these two things that we just created. So I'm going to go into ViewController, and I'm just going to put it in view did load for the purpose of this demo to be quick and easy. And as for the iOS networking code, I'm not going to go through it in too much detail, since the point of this video really is to take a look at JSON parsing. So here I'm going to say hit the API endpoint, and I'm going to declare the URL string, which is just our API call here. Now keep in mind that this is not a best practice thing to do, to have your endpoint and all the parameters and your API key hard-coded in a string like this. But again, for the purpose of this demo, I am just going to breeze through this networking code and try to explain a little on the way. So I'm turning this string into a URL object, and using this initializer for the URL object may return a nil URL. So I'm going to write a guard statement, URL is not nil, else we're just going to return, and we probably want to log something there to say what happened. But at this point, we've created a URL object, so the next thing to do is to get a URL session, and from the session we're able to create a data task. We're going to use this method right here by passing in the URL we want to hit, and we can also specify a closure or a block of code to run when we get the response back. Right, so this is going to actually make that API call, and then run this code block when we get the response back. And inside that code block is where we're going to do our JSON parsing. Notice in this in this block of code, we have a couple of input parameters that come back to us. We have the actual JSON data, we have the response from the server, and we also have a parameter representing any error that might happen. So let's go ahead and do that. And now here I'm going to pass in the URL. I'm going to force unwrap it because we checked that it's not nil already. And for this closure, I'm going to double click it to open up a closure, and I'm going to name these parameters. So data is our JSON data that comes back. Response is going to be response object, and this is just going to be an error. Inside here, we're going to just check for errors. Now I'm going to check if the error is nil, right, meaning that there is no error, because if something happened and there is an error, then this wouldn't be nil. This would contain the error object, and we could take a look at what the error is. So I just want to check that it is nil, meaning there's no errors. And I want to check that the data is not nil, meaning that there is some JSON data that comes back. Because now I would parse the JSON. There's no errors and there is JSON data to parse. Before I jump into there, I always forget this part if I don't do it immediately. So in order to actually fire off the data task, you're going to call data task.resume. Okay, so for parsing JSON, this is the fun part. This is the part where we're all waiting for. So let decoder equals JSON decoder. I'm going to create a new instance of that. And then for decoder, I'm going to use the method right here, decode. Now there are a couple of things I want to point out. Here we're specifying the type that we're trying to parse the JSON data into, and so for us that would be an instance of newsfeed, right? Because we created this just to map to this, right? So it's going to attempt to convert this JSON into an instance of newsfeed. So that's why we're passing newsfeed in there. Let me just open up that again. Here's where we pass in the JSON data, and notice that it throws. That means that potentially it can throw an error in the process of parsing that. And we're going to have to wrap that in a do catch block just because it throws. And we're going to have to use the try keyword to try to run this method. And that's kind of like our error handling. If there's an error that gets thrown, we're going to capture it gracefully, show a message or something, or log it. And that's what that throws keyword means. So let's go ahead and now implement it. So by passing in the type you're going to have to write the class name or the structure name .self, and then here we're going to pass in the data. I'm going to force unwrap it, yeah. And we're going to have to try to do that, and I'm going to set the result of the parsing into a constant called newsfeed. All right, so let's wrap this in a do catch block, and in here, error in JSON parsing. So we'll just set a breakpoint there, and here we'll just print the newsfeed. And I'll just set a breakpoint there, and I'll set a breakpoint right there for when the response comes back. And we'll run this and take a look at what happens. And let me double check if we've got everything here. We'll just indent that. Yeah, I think so. So let's go ahead and run this project. Again, in your app, you wouldn't do this in the view to load, and you would probably be a little more descriptive in your error handling. These are not very descriptive, but let's see what we get. All right, so basically it's sent off the API call, it's come back, and here we're running that closure after the response has come back. So here we're going to check if there are any errors, and you can even see down here that there is data and there are no errors. So it's going to go through that. And then this is going to create the decoder, and this is actually going to do the parsing. All right, so this is the moment of truth. Let's step over that, and let's take a look at what's in newsfeed now, as we're at this point right here. So I'm going to say PO newsfeed. Ah, cool. So it looks like we have gotten our stuff. So the status is okay. Did I capture the status? Yeah, so we do have status. Okay, so we have status is okay. Total results is 4,622, and the articles array contains 20 articles. Now let's go inside and check. Oh, you see author can be nil. I wonder if that's true or did I mess that up. Okay, the title is Genesis announces record-breaking quarter. Let's take a look at what's here. Let me just refresh this. Yeah, see, the author can be nil, and they never mention this in the documentation. See, in author here, I think they should have mentioned that. Just so good thing that in the article we made this an optional. Okay, anyways, let's go back to this. So it looks like our parsing worked, and it was so simple, right? We have the description, we have the URL to the image, and published at, so we could convert that to a real date, and we have the content. Yeah, so that's exactly how easy it is to parse JSON in Swift. And just to remind you guys what happened here, we basically created structures to map to the JSON objects in the JSON feed, and then we used JSON decoder, and we passed in the type we wanted to try to convert the JSON data into, and we just let it do its magic. Thank you for commenting on last week's video, letting me know which APIs you wanted me to see a demo of integrating with. In today's video, I want to ask you guys to do the same. Let me know below in the comment section if there's a specific API you'd like to see a demo of me integrating with, because next week I'm going to start looking through those comments and choosing some APIs to work with and do tutorials off of. If you want to support this channel, please don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Tap on that bell notification icon so you don't miss the next video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson.